Hey belly dancers, it's 9 p.m. Do you know where your hips are? There's more than one way to answer this question. Conversationally, when we talk about our hips, we often mean our hips out here, these curves out here on the outside of our bodies. But for dance class, I want for us to think about hips in terms of hip joints. So I want to make a distinction between the pelvis, being this whole bony assembly, and the hip being a joint, the hip being two joints. Right here, the interface where the leg and the pelvis meet. So please find your hips, and by this I mean find your hip joints. Find the crease where the leg and the torso meet, and then go to the center of that crease, and the hip joint is directly backwards of this spot, behind this spot. The hip joint is where the leg and the torso change their positioning relative to one another. So at this joint, for instance, you can close, bringing the leg and the torso closer together, or open, bringing leg and torso further apart. You can bring the side of the leg and the side of the torso closer together by abducting out here, or lengthen by adducting. And then at the hip joint, you also have the ability to perform rotation, changing the relationship between the front of the leg and the front of the torso, or you can think about it in terms of the pubic bone. So without rotation, my torso, my pubic bone, and the fronts of my legs are all facing the same direction. With rotation, fronts of the legs and torso are now facing in different directions. Here, I'm doing an unweighted rotation. Here, I'm doing a weighted rotation, turning the torso over the leg. Or I can have an absence of rotation, as I do now, with everything facing in the same direction. Rather than finding this standing up, an easier way to find it is on the floor. So please come on down here with me. And if you can, I would like you to sit up straight, but you can also put your hands back here to support yourself if you would like to. To start, point your knees and the tops of your thighs up toward the ceiling. And in this placement, you have an absence of rotation or a parallel orientation. Next, relax. Let the tops of the thighs fall out toward the outside. This orientation is a relaxed turnout or a gentle or subtle turnout. Pull back up to parallel and then relax and let the legs turn out. For the sake of comparison, pull your legs out a little more. This position, using engagement to get more rotation, is called an engaged turnout. And you will encounter it occasionally in belly dance, in turns, in transitions, but it's not a fundamental, not part of our beginner curriculum. For beginner purposes, we just need two orientations of the leg, parallel, and relaxed turnout. Before we get up from the floor, I also want to spend a moment finding pointed feet. And notice I said pointed feet, not pointed toes. Toes are part of it, but we're really looking at feet. In order to point, first, flex. And as much as you can, direct those toes back toward yourself and spread them out. And if you can get your heel up off of the floor, do it. Now reach the toes long and arc from back towards yourself to up, over, forward, and then at the very end, down, elongating the top surface of the ankle and the top of the foot. Think about the heel of the foot pushing up toward the ceiling and up and over and down, while the toe end of the foot, the ball end of the foot, reaches long and arcs down. And relax and do it again. Flex those toes back, reach them back, and then up, and then over, and at the very end, extend the foot long. Try not to crunch the toes. Don't make a fist, make a dome. Think about pointing, not just with the toes, but with the whole foot, trying to shorten the underside of the arch, trying to lengthen the top surface, the ankle and the top of the foot. And relax, and let's stand up. Standing, we are going to find a stance. Because these two words come from the same root, a stance is a way of standing. And just like you need to crawl before you walk, you need to have a stance before you can dance. In the beginner curriculum, we work from 2 basic stances: a parallel stance and a staggered stance. And we have the option to vary both of those by layering on a spiral. For any stance, we want to think about aligning ourselves into placement in terms of 9 anatomical landmarks. Our landmarks are feet, knees, hips, pelvis, heart or rib cage, shoulder girdle, spine, skull, and breath, breathing. And I know breath is not exactly a landmark, it's more of a action, but just go with me on this. Think about breath as the 9th place, the 9th thing. Let's go through those one more time. Say it with me if you like. Feet, knees, hips, pelvis, heart, shoulder girdle, spine, skull, and breath. Assemble these 9 landmarks into our most basic stance, a basic parallel stance. Your feet are under your knees, are under your hips, and your knees are hip width apart under the hip joints. They are soft and they are facing forward. Hips are neutral in terms of rotation. The fronts of the legs and the sternum are all oriented in the same direction. Your pelvis is neutral, so it is parallel to the floor, not tucked in, not pooched out, right in the middle. And the pelvis anchors you down. Keep your pelvis and your legs anchored down while you lift your heart up, and then roll your shoulders down and back. Your spine is neutral, by which I mean there is an absence of spinal rotation. Both the sternum and the pubic bone are pointed forward in the same direction, no twisting. Everything is oriented parallel. Float your skull and breathe, and put it together one more time. Feet are under knees, which in turn are under hips. Landmark 2, knees. They are soft and they are facing forward. Landmark 3, hips. Hips are over your feet, and in this basic parallel stance, both the legs and the pubic bone are facing in the same direction. You're oriented to parallel. Landmark 4, pelvis. It's neutral, not tucked in, not spilling out, right in the middle. The rim of the pelvis, the top rim, is parallel to the floor, so that if your pelvis were a basin of water, the water wouldn't spill either way. Wouldn't spill forward, wouldn't spill back. The top surface would be level and still. Landmark 5, your heart. Lift it up. And then landmark 6, shoulder girdle, clavicles and scapulae. Take them down and back. You are spreading them wide and dropping them down low while the heart pushes up. Your spine, landmark 7, is neutral. And by neutral, we mean neutral in terms of rotation. Sternum, pubic bone, both pointing in the same direction. Your skull, or if you prefer your head, is suspended and weightless. And it gets this way because it is perfectly balanced. But try not to focus on the weight of the skull sitting on the skeleton. Instead, think of your skull as buoyant, as suspended from above. And finally, 9, breathe. And keep breathing. Flow breath through your stance. And then return your attention back to where we started, to your feet, and think about weight distribution, our next concept. Try to really spread the feet out across the floor and to feel your body weight evenly distributed across the sole of each foot. To compare, take weight forward, feel what it feels like to be a little forward. Take weight over your heels, feel what it feels like to be more back over your heels, and then recenter. Find the true midpoint between the front and the back. Also make sure that weight is evenly distributed between left and right feet. Get a sense of that weight as an anchor and root yourself. Root your pelvis down through your legs, down through your feet, down through the floor, down through whatever is in the building below you until you reach the wet earth. And you want to insinuate your roots deep down into the earth, into the soil, into the bedrock. Anchor down. From that anchor, lift up, buoy upward. Feel your heart like a helium balloon reaching up toward the sky. And breathe and relax. And let's progress that basic stance into a staggered stance. Before we stagger the feet, let's make sure we have a good understanding of stage directions. We want to revisit hip rotation and also get good at keeping balance and alignment when all of the weight is on one foot. Stage directions. Stage right is your right. If this is my audience, my right is stage right. My left is stage left. Stage right or left is the right or left of the performer. Downstage is toward my audience, toward the mirror, toward whomever you are dancing for. Upstage is away from the audience. And the downstage, upstage terminology comes from a time when theater stages were literally tilted, raked, so that in a big auditorium, everyone in the audience could see all of the people on the stage. So downstage comes from a traditional idea of literally going downstage, down a slope. When we were on the floor, we found unweighted hip rotation, turning the leg underneath the torso. And now that we're standing up, let's find weighted hip rotation. Transfer your weight to your upstage foot. You're on a shallow diagonal. And now rotate your pelvis over your leg. Try to keep your pubic bone under your sternum. So you're not using spinal rotation, not turning at the waist. Instead, you're turning the whole torso from the hip, turning the whole torso away from the leg of the weighted hip. Back to parallel, and turn out, and other side. With weight on your upstage foot, with the whole torso as one unit, turn both the pubic bone and the sternum away from the leg of the weighted hip, the standing leg. Bring everything parallel again, and turn out. And parallel, and let's also, again, find the unweighted rotation. Put your weight on a slightly turned out left foot, turn out, parallel, touch down, and you want your unweighted knee and your unweighted hip and your sternum to all point downstage toward the mirror. Most of your weight is back here on your upstage leg. Center your pelvis underneath yourself. Nudge your pelvis in towards your center line. Also nudge your sternum in towards your center line. Pull up, anchor down, and here you are in a staggered stance. On the front leg, you want your toes directly under your knee. Ideally, you want to touch down with the point of your toes, but if that's not comfortable, it's also okay to be here on the ball of the foot. You want a long straight line here through your ankle. Be careful not to collapse out, don't collapse in, elongate. Stagger on the other side. First, in this front leg, turn out a little bit, unweighted rotation. Extend that leg, step back, and put your weight on a slightly turned out foot, a subtly turned out foot. Place the front leg so the knee and the hip are all pointing toward the mirror. Sternum also points to the mirror. If you haven't done so already, pull up, anchor down, nudge the hip in to be more under the sternum, nudge the sternum more over the pubic bone. Check in on the line of the foot and the ankle. Toes are under the knee, long, straight, unbroken line between the toes and the shin. Step back, and let's talk about the staggered stance that we're in terms of our 9 landmarks. Your back foot is under your knee, under your hip. Front foot is under the front knee, and the feet are turned away from one another because the legs are turned away from one another because of the external rotation in your hips. The spacing of the feet is relatively close. If you drop the heel of the front foot, the heel is relatively close to the instep of the back foot. Almost touching, not quite touching, a little space between them. Your back knee is long but soft. Don't lock out. Front knee is bent because the foot has pushed it up. Both hips are rotated slightly out. Both legs are rotated slightly out. And you'll see this when I get rid of my spinal rotation. My pubic bone is at a subtle diagonal. My downstage leg is pointed towards you. My upstage leg is pointed at a slightly deeper diagonal. Pelvis is neutral, heart is up, shoulders down and back, and my spine has a little rotation at the waist to bring my sternum over top of that front leg, to line the sternum up with that front leg. Head is floating, breath is flowing. Step back again and reorient. So again, if you take out the spinal rotation, you'll see that your legs are turned away from one another, facing in a different direction than the pubic bone. You're turning in the spine to center yourself. Come forward, lift, turn a little more, step and place the front foot. Extend, turn a little more, transfer your weight and place that front foot and stay long. Don't you dare slouch out here. Keep that pelvis right underneath yourself. Our next topic is spiraling, and a spiral can go on top of either a basic stance or a staggered stance. In order to spiral, all that you need to do is tilt and turn. That's it. These are both spinal articulations. They affect the stance landmark of the spine. Tilt looks like this. One side gets short, the other side gets long. The line of the shoulders inclines down away from parallel. Try not to lean out. Instead, arc up and over. Up and over. The turning component here, this is the same articulation that we did with the staggered stance. It's an articulation that orients the sternum away from the direction of the pubic bone. Set up in a basic stance to a shallow diagonal and combine tilt and turn in the upper body. So I'm here in my basic stance. I am going to tilt and turn, and I have now spiraled my basic stance. I've created the impression of a back bend because my downstage shoulder is both low and behind my hip. As we progress, we can add some actual back bend, but for the beginner curriculum, just tilt and turn. This is it. Other side. You're setting up in a basic stance to a shallow diagonal, tilt toward downstage, turn toward downstage. And let's also put the spiral on top of a staggered stance. Again, starting at a shallow diagonal relative to your audience. Lift, tilt, and turn. And you remember that you're already a little turned in your staggered stance, but this is turned more. So instead of having the sternum over the leg, it's beyond the leg out here. Other side. Take a staggered stance with the weight on the upstage leg. Lift, tilt, and turn. And you are staggered, or you're spiraled. You're staggered and you're spiraled. Come back to center. We're moving out of stances and spiraling, and we're going to look at the feet at heel lifts. Get parallel, get grounded, soft knees, neutral pelvis, and inhale and push the heels up and forward. You are essentially pointing the foot as we did on the floor, but instead of elongating the toes, you are flexed at the toe joint. Keep the ankles long and straight. If you'd like to go a little higher, tuck the pelvis under just a little bit so the knees can lengthen. Then soften the knees, restore the pelvis to neutral. With control, lower yourself back down. Do it again, and this time put an exhale on the heel lift and think about pushing the floor away. Also focus on strong feet, strong ankles, no ankle wobble. Inhale in preparation, exhale and push the floor away. Rise up. At the top, if your balance is unsteady, think about tightening the inside surfaces of your legs. Draw them toward one another. Zip the insides of your thighs in towards one another. For belly dance, we want to be mobile in the pelvis so that we can layer torso isolations over top of the heel lift. But if you feel like you're falling off of your base, go ahead and tighten up in your pelvis to anchor yourself over your center. But then once you get centered, try to stay centered and unlock and stay centered. Control down. Heel drops look like this. To do a heel drop, lift up and drop, 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 drop. We typically use heel drop as an accent or a time marking gesture, and it's meant to be heavy. So you go ahead and you land with the full weight of your body, and there's some reverberation, and this is what you want. This is how it is supposed to look. From a basic parallel stance, practice a knee bend. Keep your upper body up, keep your pelvis neutral. Inhale and bend down until you reach the end of the range where you can no longer keep a neutral pelvis. I think I just used a double negative. Bend down until you reach a place where if you were to bend more, your pelvis would fall out of alignment. You want to go to the end of where you can keep your pelvis in alignment, not popped out. If you do pop out, you've gone too far. So you're going here. Your knees are forward and they are staying forward, parallel, pointing forward. If you find on the way down they go somewhere else or they're wobbling, this is something to work on. You want to descend smoothly and parallel. And then from when you're down, come up by pushing the floor away. Push the floor away to restore yourself. Before you go down, think about your buoyed up sensation so you have an elastic quality to bending. And then exhale and push the floor away. One more time. Think about knees tracking smoothly and in parallel. No wobble, no deviation from the track. Exhale, push the floor away. And two more concepts before we wrap up. The first is the idea of a weighted movement versus an unweighted movement. A weighted movement happens in the hip over the foot that is supporting the majority of your body weight. Whereas an unweighted movement happens on the free side of the body. It's on the hip that is not over the weight-bearing foot. Concept 2, push versus lift, is related. For my curriculum, a push will always be a weighted move and a lift will always be an unweighted move. So for instance, in our beginner curriculum, we have tilts from side to side, and this is me, here I am, doing a tilt as a weighted movement, as a push. But we can also tilt as an unweighted movement, and when that happens, it becomes a lift, lift, lift. So let's do a final review, and remember, we are taking an inventory of maybe what you have learned, or if you aren't coming straight out of my beginner course, you are taking inventory of what you might need to brush up on so that you can move forward from a place of complete preparation. These concepts are also listed out in the written description for this class. But anyway, these are your alignment topics that you need to have a good sense of or that you need to have some facility with. They are hip rotation, pointing the foot, knowing the 9 landmarks that define stance: feet, knees, hips, pelvis, rib cage, shoulders, spine, head, breath. You need to know 2 stances: basic stance, basic parallel stance. You also need to be able to build a staggered stance and to understand how to keep yourself centered and balanced, not slouched. Pelvis nudges in toward the center, sternum nudges in towards the center, pelvis anchors down, rib cage lifts up, and you are on a slightly turned out foot, also to improve your balance. You need spiraled stance. Remember, a spiral is just a tilt and a turn. You need heel lifts. You need heel drops as a unit of dance vocabulary. Knee bends, the concept of weighted and unweighted movement, and the concept of push and lift.